The thunderous roar of the flash flood echoed against the towering red walls of Devil's Canyon as Grace Evans desperately scrambled toward higher ground, her sodden skirts weighing her down with each frantic step. Just hours ago, the 22-year-old schoolteacher had been enjoying a peaceful afternoon sketching wildflowers, but the dark storm clouds gathering in the distance had unleashed their fury with little warning, turning the dry gulch into a raging torrent of muddy water that rose with terrifying speed. Medicine Bow, Wyoming in 1885 was no place for the faint of heart, especially for a woman alone. Grace had moved west from Boston just 6 months prior, seeking adventure and independence after her father's passing left her with little reason to remain in the stifling confines of proper society. The teaching position in the frontier town had seemed like the perfect opportunity to forge her own path. Now, as the water swirled around her ankles and continued to rise, she wondered if her adventure would end before it had truly begun. "Help!" she cried out, her voice lost in the rumble of water and the distant roll of thunder. She knew it was futile. The canyon was miles from town, and few people ventured this far out during stormy weather. The narrow ledge she'd found provided temporary safety, but the water continued to rise at an alarming rate. The churning current below carried branches and debris, evidence of its destructive power. Grace clutched her sketchbook to her chest. It contained not only her drawings but also the letters from her mother, the only connection to her past life. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its careful pins, hanging in wet strands around her face as she searched desperately for a path to higher ground. The ledge she stood on was narrowing by the minute, the relentless water eating away at her sanctuary. Meanwhile, across the valley at the Diamond B Ranch, Boone Blackwell finished securing the last of his horses in the stable as the storm intensified. At 30 years old, he had built his modest cattle operation from nothing after returning from the war with little more than the clothes on his back and the horse beneath him. Years of hard work had earned him respect in Medicine Bow, though he largely kept to himself, preferring the company of his animals and the open range to town gatherings. "Something's not right, Maverick," he muttered to his steel-gray stallion as the animal shifted nervously in its stall. The horse had been restless all afternoon, even before the storm clouds had appeared on the horizon. Boone had learned to trust the animal's instincts, especially when it came to weather. This wasn't just any storm, it was the kind that reshaped the land and claimed lives. As if confirming his thoughts, his ranch hand, Tommy, burst through the stable doors, rain dripping from his slicker. "Mr. Blackwell, the creek's already jumped its banks, and man Jenkins just rode in saying there's a flash flood heading down Devil's Canyon." Boone's thoughts immediately turned to the watershed that fed the canyon. "Anyone out that way today?" Jenkins mentioned seeing smoke from a small fire earlier, thought it might be a prospector, or maybe one of them artists from back east who have been painting the scenery. A chill that had nothing to do with the rain ran down Boone's spine. "Saddle up, Maverick, I'm going to check it out." "In this weather, that's suicide, boss." "Then I'd better hurry before it gets worse," Boone replied, already reaching for his oilskin coat and hat. Within minutes, he had Maverick saddled and was riding hard toward Devil's Canyon, the rain pelting his face like tiny bullets. Grace's situation was deteriorating rapidly. The water had risen to within inches of her precarious perch, and the ledge itself was beginning to crumble under the constant assault of the flood. She had climbed as high as the steep canyon walls would allow, but without proper climbing equipment or experience, the sheer rock face above offered no escape. "Please, God," she whispered, fingers digging into the slippery rock face. "I'm not ready to die yet." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come west seeking adventure and independence, only to find herself trapped and utterly dependent on divine intervention. The water lapped at her boots, cold and insistent. Grace estimated she had perhaps 15 minutes before her position would be completely submerged. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing heart to think clearly. Panic would only hasten her demise. A sound cut through the roar of the water, different, distinct. Her eyes flew open. Was that a horse? Impossible in this weather, in this remote location. Yet there it was again, the unmistakable whinny of a horse in distress, followed by a man's voice, deep and commanding. "Hello, anyone down there?" "Here," Grace screamed, waving her arms frantically. "I'm here, please help me." Through the curtain of rain, she saw him, a tall figure on horseback at the canyon's edge, searching the churning waters below. Grace's heart leapt with hope as she called out again, praying her voice would carry over the storm's fury. Boone spotted her, a small figure pressed against the canyon wall, the water rising rapidly around her. His breath caught in his throat. He'd expected to find a grizzled prospector, or perhaps a lost cowhand, not a young woman alone in one of the most dangerous places in the territory during a flash flood. "Hold on," he shouted, already dismounting and assessing the situation. The canyon walls were too steep for Maverick to navigate, and the rushing water made a direct approach impossible. He needed to get downstream of her position and find a way across. "The water's rising fast," she called back, her voice thin with fear but surprisingly steady. Boone led Maverick along the canyon rim, moving swiftly until he found what he was looking for, a narrower section where a fallen cottonwood created a precarious bridge partway across the surging water. It was risky, but it was also her only chance. "I'm coming down," he shouted, securing Maverick to a sturdy juniper before removing his gun belt and anything else that might weigh him down. Taking the coiled rope from his saddle, he slung it across his body and began his descent into the canyon. The going was treacherous. The rain had turned the soil to slippery mud, and loose rocks gave way beneath his boots. Twice he nearly fell, catching himself at the last moment by grabbing exposed roots. By the time he reached the fallen tree, his hands were raw and bleeding, but adrenaline dulled the pain. Grace watched his progress with growing hope and terror. The water had reached her knees now, and the current was strong enough that she had to brace herself against the canyon wall to avoid being swept away. The man was making his way across the fallen tree with remarkable agility, testing each step before committing his weight. When he was about halfway across, a large branch carried by the flood slammed into the tree, causing it to shift. Grace cried out as the man fell, disappearing beneath the churning water. For a terrible moment, she thought he was lost, another life claimed by her foolishness. Then his head broke the surface downstream, arms moving powerfully against the current. Rather than fighting to return to the tree, he was swimming with the flood, angling toward her position. It was madness. The current was too strong, the debris too dangerous. Yet somehow he was gaining on her, each powerful stroke bringing him closer. Boone fought against the pull of the water, his lungs burning. The current was working both for and against him, carrying him swiftly toward the stranded woman, but threatening to dash him against rocks or submerged debris at any moment. He caught glimpses of her between the waves, her pale face, her dark hair plastered to her head, her eyes wide with fear and hope. With a final surge of effort, he reached the wall where she clung, grabbing onto a protruding rock just downstream from her position. The water thundered around them, already up to her waist. "Take my hand," he shouted over the roar, extending his arm toward her. Grace hesitated only a moment before reaching for him, her fingers closing around his wrist with surprising strength. "I can't swim," she admitted as he pulled her toward him. "You won't have to," Boone assured her, quickly uncoiling the rope from his body. "I'm going to tie this around you. When I give the signal, push off from the wall. The current will carry us downstream, but I've got a horse waiting up top. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes locked with his green eyes, he noticed, bright with fear but determined. He secured the rope around her waist, then tied the other end to himself. "Ready?" he asked, and when she nodded again, he shouted, "Now!" Together they pushed away from the wall, instantly caught in the powerful grip of the flood. The water was freezing, stealing Grace's breath as they were carried downstream. She felt the man's arm around her waist, holding her head above water as they navigated the churning chaos. Several times they were pulled under, emerging gasping and sputtering. Grace lost track of time, aware only of the man's presence beside her, his strength seemingly inexhaustible as he guided them through the flood. After what seemed like an eternity, she felt the current weaken. The man was swimming now, pulling them toward the canyon wall where the slope was less severe. Her limbs were numb with cold, but she forced herself to help, kicking as best she could in her sodden skirts. "There," he gasped, pointing to a narrow path that zigzagged up the canyon side. "We can climb out there." With the last of her strength, Grace helped him drag them both onto a small gravel bar. For a moment they lay there, breathing heavily, the rain still pelting them mercilessly. "Thank you," she managed between chattering teeth. "You saved my life." "Not yet," he replied grimly, getting to his feet and helping her up. "We need to get out of this canyon before the next surge comes through. Can you climb?" Grace looked up at the steep path. Under normal circumstances, she would have said no, but these were hardly normal circumstances. "I'll manage." The climb was arduous, the path slippery with mud and loose rocks. Twice Grace slipped, but each time the stranger caught her, his strong hands steady and sure. By the time they reached the rim of the canyon, her arms and legs were trembling with exhaustion, and her lungs burned with each breath. A soft nickering greeted them as they crested the top. A magnificent gray stallion stood nearby, pawing the ground nervously. "That's Maverick," the man said, leading her toward the horse. "He'll get us back to my ranch. It's closer than town." Only then did Grace get a clear look at her rescuer, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair plastered to his head and a strong, weathered face. His eyes, she noticed, were a piercing blue, startlingly bright against his tanned skin. "I'm Grace Evans," she said, suddenly aware of her bedraggled appearance. "The new schoolteacher in Medicine Bow." "Boone Blackwell," he replied, already checking Maverick's saddle. "Diamond B Ranch, about 3 miles east of here." Before she could respond, he lifted her onto the horse's back with surprising gentleness, then swung up behind her. One strong arm circled her waist as he gathered the reins with his free hand. "Hold on tight, Miss Evans. The ride won't be comfortable, but we need to move fast." Grace nodded, too exhausted and cold to argue. As they set off through the driving rain, she leaned back against his solid chest, grateful for the warmth and security of his presence. Her last coherent thought before exhaustion claimed her was that Boone Blackwell smelled of leather, horses, and the clean scent of rain nothing like the cologne-doused gentleman of Boston. Boone felt the exact moment when Grace lost consciousness, her body going limp against him. Alarm shot through him as he tightened his grip, urging Maverick to greater speed despite the treacherous conditions. The woman was dangerously cold. He needed to get her warm as quickly as possible. The journey back to the ranch seemed interminable. The storm showed no signs of abating, lightning occasionally illuminating the landscape in stark white flashes. Maverick picked his way carefully through the saturated terrain, the horse's instincts more reliable than human sight in these conditions. When the lights of the ranch house finally appeared through the curtain of rain, Boone felt a surge of relief. He could see Tommy waiting on the porch, lantern in hand, his expression changing from concern to shock as he made out the additional rider. "Mr. Blackwell, you found someone." "A woman, the schoolteacher from town. She's half frozen and unconscious. Get the fire stoked and bring hot water and blankets." Tommy rushed to comply as Boone dismounted, carefully lifting Grace from the saddle. She was lighter than he expected, her sodden clothes adding considerable weight to her slender frame. Cradling her against his chest, he carried her into the house, kicking the door shut behind him. The warmth of the ranch house was a blessed relief after the bitter cold of the storm. Boone laid Grace gently on the sofa near the fireplace, where Tommy was already building up the flames. "She ain't looking good, boss," Tommy observed worriedly, noting the bluish tinge to the woman's lips. "She'll be all right," Boone replied with more confidence than he felt. "Bring those blankets and then see to Maverick. He's earned extra oats tonight." Once Tommy had departed, Boone faced a delicate predicament. Grace's wet clothes were sapping what little body heat she had left, but propriety demanded caution. After a moment's hesitation, he removed her boots and sodden stockings, then wrapped her feet in a warm blanket. Her dress was another matter. Removing it would be crossing a line, yet leaving her in the drenched garment could prove fatal. He was spared the decision when Grace's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition as she focused on his face. "Mr. Blackwell," she whispered, her voice weak. "Where are we?" "My ranch," he answered, relief flooding through him. "You passed out on the ride. You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." A flush crept into her pale cheeks. "I don't have anything else to wear. I can lend you some things. They'll be too big, but they're dry." He moved toward a chest of drawers, extracting a flannel shirt and a pair of woolen trousers. "There's a screen in the corner you can change behind. I'll turn my back." Grace hesitated only briefly before accepting the clothes with trembling hands. True to his word, Boone turned away, occupying himself with brewing coffee on the cast-iron stove while she changed. The rustle of fabric and her occasional gasp as cold fingers fumbled with buttons were the only sounds besides the crackling fire and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. "I'm decent," she finally announced, her voice stronger. Boone turned to find her standing uncertainly by the fire, dwarfed by his clothing. She'd rolled the sleeves and pant legs up, but still she looked like a child playing dress-up. Her wet hair hung in dark waves down her back, and she'd wrapped one of the blankets around her shoulders like a shawl. "The coffee's almost ready," he said, suddenly aware of the unusual situation, a single woman in his home, wearing his clothes, miles from town in the middle of a raging storm. "It'll help warm you from the inside." Grace nodded gratefully, sinking back onto the sofa. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Blackwell. You risked your life for a complete stranger." "Boone," he corrected, pouring the coffee into 2 tin cups. "And I'd have done the same for anyone caught in that flood. Nevertheless, I'm grateful." She accepted the cup he offered, wrapping her hands around it to absorb its warmth. "I should have heeded the warnings about flash floods in the canyons. The storm seemed so far away when I started sketching." "The weather changes quickly in Wyoming territory," Boone replied, taking a seat in the chair opposite her. "Even locals get caught off guard sometimes." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, listening to the storm rage outside. Grace sipped her coffee, color gradually returning to her face as warmth spread through her body. "How long have you been in Medicine Bow, Miss Evans?" "Grace, please," she replied with a small smile. "Just 6 months. I came from Boston after my father died. There wasn't much keeping me there, and the advertisement for a teacher seemed like an opportunity for a fresh start. Boone nodded, understanding the appeal of beginning anew better than most. It's not an easy life out here, especially for someone used to city comforts. I'm tougher than I look, she responded, a spark of defiance in her green eyes. At least I thought I was until today. You survived a flash flood that would have claimed many experienced frontiersmen, Boone pointed out. I'd say that qualifies as tough. Grace's smile widened at that, and something shifted in the atmosphere between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different backgrounds. The moment was interrupted by Tommy's return, his slicker dripping puddles onto the wooden floor. Mavericks settled, Mr. Blackwell. Storm's getting worse, though. Creek's running higher than I've ever seen it. Boone frowned. The bridge to town, Tommy shook his head, washed out about an hour ago, according to Jenkins. We're cut off until the waters recede. Grace's eyes widened at this news. How long will that take? Depends on how much more rain we get, Boone answered honestly. Could be a day, could be several. I can't impose on you for days, Grace protested. Surely there must be some way to get back to town. Not unless you can sprout wings, madam, Tommy replied with a grin. Even if the rain stopped right now, those floodwaters won't go down till tomorrow at the earliest. The implication sank in. Grace was effectively stranded at the ranch of a man she had just met, with no chaperone and no means of communication with the outside world. In Boston, such a situation would mean social ruin. Here in the frontier, the rules were different, but still, her reputation as the town's schoolteacher was at stake. Seeing her distress, Boone spoke up. Tommy's sister, Martha, works here as a housekeeper. She's in town visiting family right now, but her room is yours for as long as you need it. No one would question your staying here under these circumstances. Grace nodded gratefully, though the worry didn't entirely leave her eyes. Thank you, I'm sorry to be such a burden. You're not a burden, Boone assured her, rising to his feet. You're a guest. Now you should rest. I'll show you to Martha's room. The room was small but neat, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a basin for washing. A hand-pieced quilt in bright colors covered the bed, adding a touch of warmth to the otherwise simple accommodations. It's not fancy, Boone apologized, lighting the oil lamp on the bedside table. It's perfect, Grace replied sincerely. Thank you again for everything. Try to get some sleep, he advised, moving toward the door. There are extra blankets in the chest if you get cold. Good night, Grace. Good night, Boone, she answered softly, the sound of her voice speaking his name creating an unexpected warmth in his chest as he closed the door behind him. Left alone, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the rain hammer against the window and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. The events of the day washed over her narrow escape from death, the remarkable bravery of the man who had saved her, and now her unusual circumstances. She should have been more concerned about her situation, but exhaustion overrode propriety. With a sigh, she slipped beneath the quilt, surrounded by the unfamiliar scents of lavender and the Wyoming prairie. Her last thought before drifting into sleep was of piercing blue eyes and strong hands that had pulled her from the raging water's hands that had treated her with nothing but gentleness and respect since the moment they'd met. Dawn broke clear and bright, the storm having spent its fury during the night. Grace awoke to unfamiliar sounds, the lowing of cattle, the neighing of horses, and the bustle of ranch life already in progress despite the early hour. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back. She rose and went to the small window, pushing aside the gingham curtains to survey her surroundings in daylight. The Diamond B Ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a main house, a large barn, several corrals, and a bunkhouse some distance away. Beyond the immediate buildings stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed, and beyond that, the endless expanse of the Wyoming prairie, still glistening with yesterday's rain. A knock at her door interrupted her observations. "Miss Evans, it's Boone. I've brought some fresh clothes that might fit you better." Grace opened the door to find him standing there, a bundle of fabric in his arms and an uncertain expression on his face. In the clear light of morning, she got her first proper look at Boone Blackwell. He was tall, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a man who worked hard for a living. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and the shadow of a beard darkened his jawline. But it was his eyes that captured her attention again, blue as a summer sky, with crow's feet at the corners that suggested he smiled more than his serious demeanor implied. "Good morning," she said, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "Thank you for the clothes." "They belong to my foreman's wife," Boone explained, handing over the bundle. "She's closer to your size than Martha. There's breakfast when you're ready, nothing fancy, just eggs and biscuits." "That sounds wonderful," Grace replied with genuine enthusiasm. "I'll be out shortly." When Grace emerged from the bedroom some minutes later, she felt considerably more presentable. The borrowed dress was simple but clean, and though it was a bit loose in the bodice and short at the ankles, it was far better than Boone's oversized clothing. She had managed to tame her hair into a simple braid using a ribbon Mrs. Foreman had thoughtfully included with the clothes. The main room of the ranch house was brighter and more welcoming in daylight. A large oak table dominated one end, while the sitting area with its stone fireplace occupied the other. The furniture was sturdy and functional rather than decorative, but there were small touches that softened the masculine space: colorful cushions on the sofa, a vase of wildflowers on the sideboard, books stacked neatly on shelves built into the wall beside the fireplace. Boone was at the stove, his back to her as he turned bacon in a cast iron skillet. The domesticity of the scene struck her, this solitary rancher cooking breakfast in his quiet home, so different from the man who had fearlessly plunged into raging floodwaters just hours before. "Something smells delicious," she said, announcing her presence. He turned, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes as he took in her appearance. "You look rested," he commented, gesturing toward the table where plates were already set. "How do you feel?" "Much better, thank you." Grace took a seat, noticing the care with which the table had been arranged, not elaborate, but thoughtful. No lasting damage beyond some bruises and sore muscles. Boone nodded, bringing the skillet to the table and dividing the bacon between their plates. "The floodwaters are receding faster than expected. Tommy rode out at first light to check the bridge. It's still underwater, but he thinks it might be passable by tomorrow morning." "That's good news," Grace responded, though she was surprised to find she wasn't as eager to return to town as she should have been. "I don't want to overstay my welcome." "You're welcome to stay as long as necessary," Boone assured her, taking his seat across from her. After a moment's hesitation, he bowed his head briefly in a silent grace before beginning to eat. The gesture touched Grace. It reminded her of her father, who had never been ostentatiously religious, but had always acknowledged his blessings before meals. She wondered what other layers existed beneath Boone Blackwell's reserved exterior. "Have you always been a rancher?" she asked as they ate. A shadow passed over his face. "No, I grew up in Missouri. My father had a small farm there. After the war, I drifted west, worked as a cowhand for a few years, saved enough to buy this place about 7 years ago." The mention of the war was brief but revealing. Grace calculated that Boone must have been very young when he fought, perhaps just a boy, like so many others who had marched off to battle on both sides of the conflict. "And you?" he asked, clearly preferring to shift the conversation away from himself. "What brought you from Boston to Medicine Bow? Teaching positions aren't exactly scarce back east." Grace considered her answer carefully. "After my father died, the house felt empty. My mother passed when I was 12 and I have no siblings. I could have stayed. There were offers of marriage from suitable gentlemen, but none of them saw me as anything more than a convenient addition to their households." She paused, surprised at her own candor. "I wanted more than that. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Wyoming territory, it felt like an opportunity for a real adventure, a chance to be useful and independent." "And has it been an adventure?" "Yes," she answered with a small smile, "though perhaps yesterday was more adventure than I bargained for." That earned a chuckle from Boone, a warm, rich sound that transformed his face and made her heart skip a beat. Wyoming has a way of testing newcomers. If you can weather the storms, literal and figurative, you'll do just fine here. Their conversation flowed easily after that, moving from the challenges of teaching children of various ages in a one-room schoolhouse to the difficulties of running a cattle ranch in a territory where harsh winters and unpredictable weather could wipe out a year's profits in a single day. Grace was surprised to discover that Boone was well-read, with opinions on everything from Shakespeare to the latest political debates in Washington. "You don't strike me as the typical cowboy," she observed as they cleared the breakfast dishes together. "And you don't strike me as the typical Eastern schoolmarm," he countered with another of those rare smiles. "People are rarely what they seem at first glance, especially out here. The West has a way of stripping away pretenses." Before Grace could respond, the door opened and Tommy burst in, his expression urgent. "Boss, we got trouble. The north pasture fence went down in the flood. Half the cattle have scattered into Walsh's property, and he's threatening to claim them as his own if they're not removed by sundown." Boone's face hardened. "Silas Walsh has been looking for an excuse to start trouble since I refused to sell him my water rights." He turned to Grace with an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, but I need to handle this." "Of course," she replied quickly. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Both men looked surprised at the offer, but it was Tommy who spoke first. "Can you ride Miss Evans?" "Tommy, she's just recovered from nearly drowning," Boone protested. "I'm not asking her to help round up cattle." "I can ride," Grace interjected, lifting her chin. "Not particularly well by Western standards, perhaps, but I had lessons in Boston. And I'm stronger than I look." Boone studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "This isn't a leisurely ride through a city park. It's rough country, and Walsh is not a man to be trifled with." "I understand," Grace replied steadily. "But you saved my life yesterday. The least I can do is help save your livelihood today." A flicker of respect and something else, something warmer, passed through Boone's eyes. "Very well. Tommy, find Miss Evans something suitable to ride. And see if Martha left any riding skirts that might fit her." Within the hour, Grace found herself on horseback, riding alongside Boone and three of his ranch hands toward the disputed north pasture. She wore a divided riding skirt that had been hastily altered to fit her smaller frame and a borrowed hat to shield her face from the sun, which now shone with an intensity that belied yesterday's storm. The countryside was transformed by the recent rains. What had been dusty brown earth was now vibrant with green shoots and wildflowers that had sprung up overnight, as if by magic. Streams that had been mere trickles were now flowing vigorously, and the air itself seemed cleaner, fresher. "It's beautiful," Grace remarked as they crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape. I've never seen anything like it. Flash floods are destructive, Boone acknowledged, reining his horse alongside hers, but they bring new life to the land. It's the way of things out here, destruction and renewal, always in balance. There was a poetry to his words that surprised her. This man continued to defy her expectations at every turn. Their contemplation was interrupted by the sight of cattle scattered across the rolling hills beyond a broken fence line. In the distance, several riders were already moving among the animals, attempting to herd them in the opposite direction away from Diamond B land. "Walsh's men," Boone growled, his expression darkening. "They're trying to drive our cattle deeper into his property to strengthen his claim on them." He turned to his men. "Jim, take the east flank, Miguel the west, Tommy, ride ahead and cut off that group near the creek." "What about me?" Grace asked as the men spurred their horses in different directions. Boone hesitated. "Stay with me. Walsh is less likely to try anything with a woman present." They rode hard toward the broken fence line, where the largest concentration of Diamond B cattle identifiable by their brand were being herded by two of Walsh's cowboys. As they approached, Grace could see that the men were using their whips freely, driving the frightened animals with unnecessary force. "That's enough," Boone called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "Those are Diamond B cattle, Walsh, and you know it." A heavy-set man with a florid face and an elaborate handlebar mustache turned his horse to face them. His small eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of Grace beside Boone. "Well, well, Blackwell. Brought a lady to do your fighting for you." "These cattle crossed onto my land, and according to territorial law, that makes them mine to claim. The law also states that in cases of natural disasters, owners have reasonable time to recover their livestock," Boone countered, his voice level despite the tension evident in his posture. "The flash flood that took down my fence qualifies. We're here to take our cattle home." Walsh sneered, his gaze sliding to Grace with an appraising look that made her skin crawl. "And who might this lovely creature be? Don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Miss Evans is the new schoolteacher from Medicine Bow," Boone replied before Grace could speak. "She's a guest at my ranch until the bridge is repaired." Something ugly flashed in Walsh's eyes. "Is that what they are calling it these days? Guest?" The insinuation was clear, and Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks not from embarrassment, but from anger. Before Boone could respond, she urged her horse forward, sitting straight in the saddle as she addressed Walsh directly. "Mr. Walsh, I was caught in yesterday's flash flood in Devil's Canyon. Mr. Blackwell saved my life at considerable risk to his own. Due to the bridge being washed out, I've been stranded at his ranch, where he and his employees have shown me nothing but respect and kindness. I would appreciate the same courtesy from you, sir." Walsh looked momentarily taken aback by her forthright manner, but he recovered quickly. "My apologies, Miss Evans. I meant no disrespect." The words were proper, but his tone suggested otherwise. "However, the matter of these cattle remains. I've lost good grazing land to flooding, and these animals are consuming what little is left. We'll move them back to Diamond B land immediately," Boone stated. "You have my word they won't trouble your grass again." "Your word?" Walsh laughed harshly. "Your word means nothing to me, Blackwell. But I'll make you a deal, $5 a head for the cattle that crossed over. Consider it compensation for damages to my property." Grace could see Boone's jaw tighten. $5 a head was an exorbitant price, especially for cattle that had strayed through no fault of their owner. "That's highway robbery, Walsh, and you know it," Boone replied evenly. "The fence came down in a natural disaster. No court would hold me liable for damages." "Perhaps not," Walsh conceded with a malicious smile. "But by the time you get a judge out here, These cattle will have been sold and shipped to Denver. Your choice, Blackwell." The standoff was interrupted by the arrival of Tommy and the other ranch hands, who had successfully rounded up most of the scattered cattle and were now driving them toward the broken fence line. They reined in their horses as they sensed the tension between their boss and Walsh. "Everything all right, Mr. Blackwell?" Tommy asked, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. Boone never took his eyes off Walsh. "Everything's fine, Tommy." Mr. Walsh was just explaining that he understands these are Diamond B cattle and will be helping us move them back across the fence line. "Isn't that right, Walsh?" For a moment, Grace thought the other man would refuse. His face darkened with anger and his hand twitched toward his own weapon. But something, perhaps the arrival of Boone's men or perhaps some calculation of the odds, made him reconsider. "This time, Blackwell," he spat, "but our business isn't finished, not by a long shot." His gaze shifted to Grace, his smile oily. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Evans. I do hope you'll consider visiting my ranch before you return to town. I could show you some real Western hospitality." "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Walsh," Grace replied coolly, "but I find Mr. Blackwell's hospitality quite satisfactory." Walsh's smile faltered, and with a curt nod, he wheeled his horse around and signaled to his men. They rode off toward the larger Walsh ranch house visible in the distance, leaving Boone's crew to begin the task of herding the cattle back to Diamond B land. "I apologize for Walsh," Boone said quietly as they watched the men work. "He's been a thorn in my side since I bought this land. His family has been in Wyoming for 2 generations, and he considers newcomers like me to be intruders." "You handled him well," Grace observed. "I might have lost my temper." The corner of Boone's mouth quirked up. "You didn't exactly hold back yourself, schoolteacher. I thought Walsh might fall off his horse when you put him in his place." Grace laughed, the tension of the confrontation melting away. "My father always said I had more courage than sense. It's gotten me into trouble more than once." "It suited you just fine today," Boone replied, his eyes warm as they met hers. For a moment they simply looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. Then Boone cleared his throat and turned back to the task at hand. "We'd better help with these cattle. It'll be a long day getting them all back where they belong." And indeed it was. Grace worked alongside the ranch hands for hours, helping to guide the cattle back through the broken fence line and keeping them contained while Boone and his men made temporary repairs. By mid-afternoon, the sun was high and hot, and Grace was beginning to feel the effects of the previous day's ordeal. Boone noticed her flagging energy. "You should head back to the ranch," he suggested, riding up beside her. "You've done more than enough for one day, especially after what you went through yesterday." Pride made her want to refuse, to prove she was as capable as any of his cowboys, but wisdom prevailed. "Perhaps you're right," she conceded, "though I hate to leave the work unfinished." "You've earned your rest," Boone assured her. "Tommy can escort you back." "I can find my way," Grace protested. "I don't want to take one of your men away from the work." Boone hesitated, clearly torn between concern for her safety and the practical need to keep his crew intact. "It's 3 miles back to the ranch, and there's still Walsh to consider." "I'll be fine," Grace insisted, pointing to the ridge line that was clearly visible in the distance. "The ranch is just beyond that rise. I can see it from here." After another moment's consideration, Boone nodded reluctantly. "Follow the creek bed. It's the most direct route. We'll be back before sundown." Grace rode at a leisurely pace, allowing her horse, a gentle mare named Daisy, to pick its way along the creek bed as instructed. The exertion of the day, combined with the aftereffects of her near drowning, had left her more tired than she wanted to admit. Still, There was a satisfaction in knowing she had been useful, that she had contributed to repaying the debt she owed Boone Blackwell. As she crested the final rise before the ranch came into view, Grace reined in her horse to admire the vista. The Diamond B was not the largest ranch in the territory, nor the most prosperous, but there was something appealing about its modest, well-maintained buildings nestled against the backdrop of distant mountains. It spoke of hard work and determination, qualities she had come to associate with its owner. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled her from her reverie. For a moment, she thought Boone had sent one of his men to check on her after all. But as the rider drew closer, her heart sank. It was Silas Walsh, alone this time, his expression unpleasantly triumphant as he blocked her path. "Miss Evans," he greeted her, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "Fancy meeting you out here all alone." Grace straightened in her saddle, fighting the urge to turn daisy and ride in the opposite direction. "Mr. Walsh, I was just returning to the ranch." "Blackwell's ranch," Walsh corrected, his smile not reaching his eyes. "A fine property, though not as fine as mine. I offered to buy him out when he first arrived, offered a fair price too, but he's stubborn, your Mr. Blackwell." "He's not my Mr. Blackwell," Grace replied evenly, though something in her chest tightened at the implication. "And if you'll excuse me, I should be getting back. They'll be expecting me." Walsh made no move to clear her path. "You know, I've been wondering what a refined lady like yourself sees in a man like Boone Blackwell. He's got no family to speak of, no connections, just a small-time rancher with delusions of importance." "Mr. Blackwell saved my life," Grace responded, her patience wearing thin. "That speaks more to his character than any amount of land or connections. Now, please move aside." Instead of complying, Walsh urged his horse closer to hers. "I could save your reputation, Miss Evans. There's already talk in town about you staying out at the Diamond B without a proper chaperone. People will talk, you know. But if you were to come to my ranch instead, as my guest, with my housekeeper to attend you, well, that would be much more appropriate, wouldn't it?" The thinly veiled threat was clear, and Grace felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. "Are you suggesting that you would spread rumors about me if I don't accept your hospitality, Mr. Walsh?" he shrugged, the gesture calculated in its casualness. "I'm merely pointing out the reality of your situation. A schoolteacher's reputation is her most valuable asset. Parents won't want their children taught by a woman of questionable moral standing." Grace's grip tightened on the reins. "I think the parents of Medicine Bow know me well enough to disregard malicious gossip, Mr. Walsh, especially when it comes from a man who attempts to intimidate a woman alone on the road." Walsh's face darkened. "That's a very foolish attitude, Miss Evans, very foolish indeed. I'm a respected member of this community. My word carries weight." "So does mine," came a new voice, hard as steel. Both Grace and Walsh turned to see Boone approaching on Maverick, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene before him. Behind him rode Tommy and Miguel, their hands hovering near their weapons. "Blackwell," Walsh acknowledged, his demeanor shifting from threatening to jovial with practiced ease. "Just having a friendly chat with Miss Evans here, offering her the hospitality of my ranch given the awkward nature of her current accommodations." "How considerate," Boone replied, the words dripping with sarcasm. "But Miss Evans has already accepted my hospitality. And speaking of awkward, I find it extremely awkward to discover you accosting her on my property." Walsh's smile vanished. "We're on the county road, Blackwell, public land." "The county road runs a quarter-mile east of here," Boone corrected. "You're on Diamond B land right now, and you're not welcome." For a tense moment, the two men stared at each other, the animosity between them almost palpable. Grace held her breath, acutely aware that the situation could turn violent at any moment. Then Walsh laughed, the sound as artificial as his earlier friendliness. "No need for hostilities, Blackwell. I was just leaving." He turned to Grace with a tip of his hat. "Think about what I said, Miss Evans. The offer stands." As Walsh rode away, Boone moved his horse alongside Grace's, his expression softening as he looked at her. "Are you all right? Did he threaten you?" "Not directly," Grace answered, still shaken by the encounter. "But he made it clear he could cause problems for me in town." "Regarding my reputation." Anger flashed in Boone's eyes. "Walsh is all talk. No one in Medicine Bow with any sense would listen to his gossip." "Perhaps," Grace replied, less confident. She had worked hard to establish herself as a respectable, dedicated teacher. The idea that all could be undone by malicious rumors was deeply unsettling. Sensing her distress, Boone reached across the space between their horses to cover her hand with his own. "Trust me, Grace. The people of Medicine Bow know a good person when they see one. You've nothing to fear from Silas Walsh." The warmth of his hand and the quiet conviction in his voice steadied her. "Thank you," she said softly, aware of Tommy and Miguel discreetly averting their gazes, "for everything." They rode back to the ranch together, Boone explaining that he had become concerned when she hadn't arrived and had left his men to finish the fencing while he came to check on her. The simple admission that he had worried about her sent a strange flutter through Grace's chest. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in vivid oranges and pinks. The day's work had clearly taken its toll on everyone. Even Boone, with his seemingly inexhaustible energy, moved with the careful deliberation of a man feeling every one of his muscles. Dinner that evening was a communal affair, with Tommy and Miguel joining them at the large kitchen table. The meal was simple but hearty: venison stew, fresh bread, and canned peaches for dessert. Grace found herself relaxing into the easy camaraderie of the men, their conversation flowing from cattle prices to local gossip to good-natured ribbing about Miguel's hopeless pursuit of the blacksmith's daughter. "She's out of your league, amigo," Tommy teased. "A man who smells like horse manure has no business courting a girl who smells like roses." "At least I have the courage to try," Miguel retorted with a grin. "Unlike some, I could mention who stare at Sally Jenkins like a lovesick calf every time she serves him coffee at the diner." Tommy's face turned red as Boone and Grace laughed. "That's different," he mumbled. "Sally's father doesn't approve of cowboys." "Her father doesn't approve of anyone," Boone pointed out. "The man still thinks his daughter should marry a bank president or a railroad magnate." "Well, a father wants the best for his daughter," Grace said, her thoughts turning briefly to her own father. "Though sometimes what he thinks is best and what actually is best are two very different things." "Speaking from experience, Miss Evans?" Miguel asked with gentle curiosity. Grace nodded, surprised to find herself willing to share such personal matters with these relative strangers who somehow already felt like friends. "My father had arranged a match for me with the son of a business associate. Daniel Harrington was wealthy, well-educated, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He saw me as a suitable decoration for his home and little else." "What happened?" Tommy asked, clearly invested in the story. "My father died before the engagement could be formalized," Grace explained. "And without his influence, Daniel's interest in me waned rather quickly, particularly when he discovered my father's business had been struggling and my inheritance would be modest at best." "His loss," Boone commented quietly, his eyes meeting hers across the table, "and Medicine Bow's gain." The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have. "In any case," she continued, breaking the moment, "I've found I much prefer making my own decisions about my future." Here, here, Miguel lifted his coffee cup in a toast, to making our own decisions. The others joined in, the mood lightening as conversation turned to other topics. But throughout the evening, Grace was aware of Boone's gaze returning to her when he thought she wasn't looking. And more disconcertingly, she was aware of her own gaze seeking him out just as often. Later, as she helped clear the dishes despite Boone's protests that she was a guest, not a servant, Grace found herself standing beside him at the wash basin, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked. Each brief contact sent a spark of awareness through her that was both thrilling and alarming. "I wanted to thank you again," she said softly as they finished the last of the dishes, "for coming to my aid with Walsh today, and yesterday, of course." Boone turned to face her, his expression serious. "You don't need to keep thanking me, Grace. Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," she disagreed. "It takes a special kind of courage to ride into a flash flood to save a stranger, and a special kind of kindness to welcome that stranger into your home afterward." Something shifted in his eyes, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "Perhaps I was tired of being alone," he admitted, the words barely above a whisper. The confession hung between them, simple yet profound. Grace felt an answering ache in her own heart, the recognition of a shared loneliness, a shared yearning for connection. "I understand that feeling," she replied, equally soft. "Boston was full of people, yet I'd never felt more alone than in the months after my father died." Boone nodded, and in that moment, Grace felt seen in a way she hadn't experienced before. Truly seen, not as the Boston Society daughter, nor as the Medicine Bow schoolteacher, but simply as herself, with all her complexities and contradictions. The spell was broken by Tommy's return to the kitchen, his arrival causing them to step apart, though Grace hadn't even realized how close they had been standing. "Bridge should be passable by morning, Mr. Blackwell," Tommy reported. "Jenkins rode by to say the water's dropped considerably." "Thank you, Tommy," Boone acknowledged, his professional demeanor firmly back in place. "We'll take Miss Evans back to town after breakfast then." Grace felt an unexpected pang at the news. As much as she knew she needed to return to her duties in Medicine Bow, the prospect of leaving the Diamond B, of leaving Boone, was suddenly unwelcome. "I should turn in," she said, needing space to sort through her confusing emotions. "It's been a long day." "Of course," Boone replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Boone," she answered, retreating to the small bedroom that had become her sanctuary. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind too full of conflicting thoughts and feelings. In just 2 days, Boone Blackwell had upended her carefully ordered world. He had saved her life, defended her honor, and worst of all, made her question the independence she had so fiercely guarded since arriving in Wyoming. The idea that she could be developing feelings for him, a man she barely knew, was both exhilarating and terrifying. By the time dawn broke, Grace had reached a decision. She would return to Medicine Bow as planned, resume her teaching duties, and maintain a friendly but distant relationship with Boone Blackwell. It was the sensible thing to do, the proper thing. Anything else would be foolhardy, especially with Silas Walsh looking for any excuse to damage her reputation. Breakfast was a subdued affair, with Tommy and Miguel already out tending to the morning chores. Boone seemed as reserved as she felt, their conversation limited to polite inquiries about how she had slept and whether she felt recovered enough for the journey to town. After the meal, Grace changed back into her own clothes, which had been washed and dried during her stay. The familiar garments felt strange after the borrowed dress, and riding skirt a reminder that she was returning to her regular life, leaving behind the brief adventure at the Diamond B Ranch. When she emerged from the bedroom with her small bundle of belongings, Boone was waiting by the front door, his hat in his hands. "Maverick's saddled and ready," he said. "I thought you might prefer if I took you to town myself, rather than sending you with Tommy." "That's very thoughtful," Grace replied, hoping her voice didn't betray the flutter of pleasure his words evoked. "Thank you." The ride to Medicine Bow was conducted mostly in silence, both of them seemingly lost in their own thoughts. The landscape, washed clean by the recent storm, was breathtaking in the morning light, rolling hills covered in wildflowers, the distant mountains crisp against the blue sky. Occasionally, Boone would point out a landmark or share a bit of local history, and Grace would respond with appropriate interest. But the easy camaraderie of the previous evening seemed to have been replaced by a polite formality that neither could quite break through. As they approached the outskirts of town, Grace could see that the flood had left its mark here as well. Debris littered the main street, and several buildings showed signs of water damage. The recently repaired bridge across Medicine Bow River bore the scars of the rushing water but had been reinforced with new timbers and was now passable. People stopped to stare as Boone and Grace rode into town together, curious glances and whispered comments that made Grace acutely aware of how their arrival might appear. She sat straighter in the saddle, determined to show no discomfort or embarrassment. She had nothing to be ashamed of, after all. They stopped outside the small clapboard house where Grace rented rooms from the widow Mrs. Hollister. The elderly woman was already on the porch, her relief evident as she spotted her tenant. "Miss Evans. Oh, thank the Lord you're safe. We were so worried when you didn't come home during the storm. Mr. Jenkins said the bridge was washed out, and then with the flash flood in the canyon." "I'm perfectly fine, Mrs. Hollister," Grace assured her, dismounting with Boone's assistance. "Mr. Blackwell rescued me from the canyon and kindly offered me shelter until the bridge was repaired." Mrs. Hollister's sharp eyes took in Boone with obvious appraisal. "That was mighty brave of you, Mr. Blackwell. The whole town's been talking about how dangerous those floods were." "Just happened to be in the right place at the right time, madam," Boone replied modestly, tipping his hat to the older woman. Grace turned to face him, suddenly reluctant to say goodbye despite her earlier resolution. "I don't know how to thank you properly for everything you've done." "No thanks necessary," Boone assured her, his eyes softening as they met hers. "I'm just glad you're safe." For a moment they simply looked at each other, so much left unsaid between them. Then Boone cleared his throat and stepped back, replacing his hat. "I should let you get settled back in." "Good day, Miss Evans, Mrs. Hollister." "Good day, Mr. Blackwell," Grace replied formally, aware of Mrs. Hollister's curious gaze, "and thank you again." As Boone rode away, Mrs. Hollister put a gentle hand on Grace's arm. "Come inside, dear. You look exhausted, and I want to hear every detail of your adventure." The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Grace resumed her teaching duties and helped with the town's recovery efforts. The schoolhouse had suffered minimal damage from the storm, but several families had lost homes or livestock, and the community had rallied together to provide assistance. Grace threw herself into the work, organizing the older students to help with cleanup while continuing their lessons, and arranging a donation drive for those most affected by the flood. She heard nothing from Boone during this time, though she found herself watching the street through the schoolhouse window, half hoping to catch a glimpse of him on the occasions when ranchers came to town for supplies. Tommy rode in once to pick up mail and provisions, and he tipped his hat to her with a friendly smile. But he offered no news of his employer, beyond saying that they were still repairing flood damage at the ranch. It was nearly 2 weeks after her return to town when Grace encountered Silas Walsh again. She was leaving the general store, her arms full of books and supplies for the school, when his imposing figure blocked her path. "Miss Evans," he greeted her with that same insincere smile. "You're looking well. Recovered from your ordeal, I see." "Mr. Walsh," she acknowledged stiffly, trying to step around him. "If you'll excuse me, I have preparations to make for tomorrow's lessons." He moved to block her again, his expression hardening. "I've been patient, Miss Evans. I gave you time to consider my offer, but I haven't heard from you. That's rather impolite, wouldn't you say?" "I wasn't aware I had an offer to consider," Grace replied coldly. "As I recall, you made veiled threats about my reputation, which I chose to ignore." Walsh's face darkened. "I'd reconsider that stance if I were you. The school board meets next week to review teacher contracts for the coming year. It would be a shame if certain concerns were raised about your character." Fear flashed through Grace, quickly replaced by anger. "Are you threatening my position, Mr. Walsh?" "Merely pointing out realities," he replied smoothly. "I have considerable influence with several board members. A good word from me could ensure your continued employment. Conversely." He left the implication hanging, his meaning clear. Grace felt sick at the blatant attempt at coercion, but she refused to show weakness. "I believe my teaching record speaks for itself, Mr. Walsh. If the board chooses to dismiss me based on unfounded gossip rather than my performance, then perhaps Medicine Bow isn't the community I thought it was." Walsh's smile turned predatory. "Such bravado. But we both know you need this position, Miss Evans. Your options are limited, especially now that your association with Blackwell has become common knowledge." Grace was about to deliver a scathing retort when a new voice entered the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" They both turned to see Boone approaching, his expression neutral but his eyes hard as flint as they fixed on Walsh. Grace felt a rush of relief at his appearance, followed by annoyance at herself for needing rescue yet again. "No problem at all," Walsh answered smoothly. "Just catching up with our esteemed schoolteacher. Town business, you understand." "I understand you're harassing Miss Evans," Boone countered, moving to stand beside her. "That's not town business, that's bullying." Walsh's false pleasantness vanished. "This doesn't concern you, Blackwell." "When I see a man twice the size of a lady blocking her path and making threats, it concerns me," Boone replied evenly. "Now, I suggest you step aside and let Miss Evans continue about her day." For a moment, it seemed Walsh might refuse. His hand twitched toward the gun at his hip, and Grace held her breath, suddenly afraid the confrontation would turn violent. But then Walsh's gaze shifted, taking in the growing number of townspeople who had paused to observe the interaction. With visible effort, he forced a laugh. "Always the knight in shining armor, aren't you, Blackwell? Very well, I'll leave Miss Evans to your protection." He tipped his hat mockingly. "Until next time, Miss Evans." As Walsh strode away, Boone turned to Grace, concern evident in his expression. "Are you all right? What did he want?" "I'm fine," she assured him, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her grip on the books. "He was just making more insinuations about my reputation and threatening my position at the school." Boone's jaw tightened. "That man needs to be taught a lesson." "Not by you," Grace said quickly, touching his arm to stay any rash action. "Violence won't solve this, Boone. It would only make things worse." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face, his expression softening. "You're probably right. But I don't like the idea of him intimidating you." "I can handle Silas Walsh," Grace stated with more confidence than she felt. "But I do appreciate your concern." For a moment, they stood together in the middle of the street, aware of the curious glances from passers-by but reluctant to part ways. Finally, Boone cleared his throat. "May I walk you back to the schoolhouse? Those books look heavy." Grace hesitated, knowing that being seen with Boone again would only add fuel to Walsh's rumors. But the genuine concern in his eyes and the simple pleasure of his company outweighed her caution. "I'd like that," she replied softly. As they walked together down the main street, Boone relieving her of the heaviest books, Grace found herself stealing glances at his profile. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that she had come to admire deeply in the short time she had known him. "How have you been?" she asked, breaking the companionable silence. "Tommy mentioned you were still dealing with flood damage at the ranch." Boone nodded. "The north pasture fence took the worst of it, but we've got that repaired now. Lost a few head of cattle, but not as many as some of the smaller ranchers. All in all, we were lucky." "And how is Maverick and Daisy?" Grace inquired, smiling at the memory of the gentle mare she had ridden. "Both fine," Boone assured her, returning her smile. "Daisy's been restless, though. I think she misses you." The simple statement, delivered casually, made Grace's heart skip. "I miss her too," she admitted. "And the ranch, it was peaceful there." Boone glanced at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "You'd be welcome to visit any time. Tommy and Miguel ask about you." "And Martha's returned from town. She was sorry to have missed meeting you." "I'd like that," Grace replied, the words escaping before she could consider their implications. They had reached the schoolhouse, a simple white building with a bell tower that served as both school and community meeting hall. Boone handed back the books, his fingers briefly brushing hers in the exchange. The contact, fleeting as it was, sent a now familiar warmth through her veins. "Thank you for the escort," Grace said, suddenly self-conscious, "and for intervening with Walsh." "Anytime," Boone replied, his gaze holding hers a moment longer than necessary. "Take care of yourself, Grace." As she watched him walk away, Grace couldn't help but feel that her carefully laid plans for maintaining distance were already in tatters. Boone Blackwell was becoming increasingly important to her, and the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. The school board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, and as the day approached, Grace found herself growing increasingly anxious. She had always been confident in her teaching abilities, but Walsh's threats had planted seeds of doubt. What if he did have enough influence to sway the board against her? What would she do if she lost her position? The day of the meeting, Grace dismissed her students with extra reading assignments and spent an hour meticulously cleaning the schoolhouse, as if the cleanliness of the space might somehow reflect on her competence as a teacher. She was arranging her desk for the third time when a knock at the door interrupted her nervous activity. To her surprise, it was Mrs. Jenkins, the wife of the town's most prominent merchant and a member of the school board. The older woman entered with a warm smile, taking in Grace's flustered appearance with knowing eyes. "Working late, Miss Evans." "Just tidying up before the board meeting," Grace replied, smoothing her already immaculate skirt. "Is there something I can help you with, Mrs. Jenkins?" The older woman's expression turned serious. "Actually, I came to help you, my dear. I thought you should know what you might be walking into tonight." Grace's stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" "Silas Walsh has been busy, Mrs. Jenkins explained, settling into one of the student desks with a sigh. "He's been speaking to board members, suggesting that your situation with Mr. Blackwell during the flood was improper. He's pushing for your dismissal." Though she had suspected as much, having it confirmed was still a blow. "I see," Grace replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "And do the other board members share his concerns?" Mrs. Jenkins snorted inelegantly. "Some might if they didn't know better. Fortunately, most of us do." My Herbert thinks the world of you, says you've taught our Jimmy more in 6 months than he learned in 2 years with old Mr. Finch. And the Petersons are firmly in your corner since you helped their daughter overcome her reading difficulties. Relief washed through Grace. So Walsh doesn't have the influence he claims. He has some, Mrs. Jenkins admitted. Enough to make trouble, certainly, but not enough to get you dismissed without cause. Still, I thought you should be prepared. It might get ugly tonight. Thank you for the warning, Grace said sincerely, grateful for the woman's candor. I appreciate knowing what I'm facing. Mrs. Jenkins rose, patting Grace's hand maternally. You're a good teacher, Miss Evans, and a good person. Don't let Silas Walsh make you doubt that. Just be honest with the board tonight. That's all anyone can ask. After the older woman left, Grace sat at her desk, trying to collect her thoughts. She had done nothing wrong, nothing to be ashamed of. Yes, she had stayed at Boone's ranch, but under circumstances that no reasonable person could object to. And yes, perhaps her feelings for him were developing beyond simple gratitude, but she had acted with perfect propriety at all times. She would face the board with dignity and truth. And if that wasn't enough, if Walsh's malice prevailed, then perhaps Medicine Bow wasn't where she belonged after all. The board meeting was held in the town hall, a slightly larger version of the schoolhouse with rows of benches instead of desks. When Grace arrived, the room was already half full with board members and interested citizens. She took a seat in the front row, her back straight, and her expression composed despite the nervous fluttering in her stomach. Silas Walsh sat among the board members, his satisfied smirk making it clear that he anticipated victory. Grace met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. As the meeting progressed through routine matters, budget approvals, discussion of needed repairs to the school roof, plans for the upcoming term, Grace found her anxiety mounting. Finally, Chairman Peterson cleared his throat and addressed the issue she had been dreading. Now, before we conclude, Mr. Walsh has asked to discuss a matter concerning our current teacher, Miss Evans. Mr. Walsh, you have the floor. Walsh stood, his imposing figure commanding attention as he faced the assembled townspeople. Thank you, Chairman Peterson. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, concerned citizens of Medicine Bow, I come before you tonight with a heavy heart. It is never pleasant to question the character of a lady, especially one entrusted with the education of our children. But recent events have raised concerns that cannot be ignored. He paused dramatically, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Grace. As many of you know, during the recent flood, Miss Evans spent several days at the ranch of Mr. Boone Blackwell unchaperoned, and in a situation that can only be described as compromising. A murmur ran through the audience. Grace kept her expression neutral, though anger burned in her chest at Walsh's deliberate distortion of the facts. I submit to this board, Walsh continued, his voice rising, that such behavior demonstrates a lack of judgment and propriety that makes Miss Evans unsuitable as a model for our impressionable children. I therefore move for her immediate dismissal and the commencement of a search for a more appropriate instructor. As he sat down, looking smugly satisfied, Chairman Peterson addressed Grace. Miss Evans, would you care to respond to these allegations? Grace rose slowly, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she faced the board. Thank you, Chairman Peterson. I appreciate the opportunity to address Mr. Walsh's concerns directly. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. The facts are these. 2 weeks ago, I was sketching in Devil's Canyon when a flash flood caught me by surprise. The water rose rapidly, trapping me against the canyon wall with no means of escape. Had Mr. Blackwell not arrived when he did, riding into dangerous floodwaters to reach me, I would not be standing before you today." Her gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of parents whose children she taught, neighbors she had come to know in her months in Medicine Bow. "After rescuing me, Mr. Blackwell took me to his ranch because the bridge to town had been washed out. I was exhausted, half drowned, and in no condition to attempt an alternate route. At the ranch, I was given a private room and treated with nothing but respect and kindness by Mr. Blackwell and his employees. As soon as the bridge was repaired, he personally escorted me back to town." She turned to face Walsh directly. "These are the facts, plain and simple. If Mr. Walsh chooses to see something improper in a man saving a drowning woman and offering her shelter during a natural disaster, perhaps that speaks more to his character than to mine." The room erupted in murmurs and nods of approval. Mrs. Jenkins was smiling openly, and even the usually stoic Chairman Peterson looked impressed by her composed defense. Walsh's face had darkened with anger, but before he could respond, the door at the back of the hall opened. Boone Blackwell entered, followed by Tommy Miguel, and to Grace's surprise, several other ranchers and townspeople she recognized. They filed in silently, taking up positions along the back wall. Boone's gaze found Grace immediately, his expression unreadable but his presence reassuring nonetheless. Chairman Peterson cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwell, I wasn't aware you had an interest in school board matters." "I don't generally," Boone replied, his deep voice carrying easily in the suddenly quiet room. "But when I heard that Silas Walsh was attempting to use Miss Evans's misfortune to smear her reputation, I felt compelled to attend, and I wasn't the only one." One of the other ranchers, a grizzled older man Grace knew as Mr. Harmon, stepped forward. "My wife and I have been putting up travelers stranded by bad weather for 20 years. It's the way things are done out here. If Walsh is suggesting there's something improper about offering shelter to someone in need, then he's calling half the decent folk in this territory immoral." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Another man, the blacksmith whose daughter Miguel admired, spoke up next. "My Sally was caught in that same storm coming back from her aunt's place. If someone hadn't taken her in till the weather cleared, she'd have been in real trouble. That's just being a good neighbor, not something to gossip about." Walsh stood again, his face mottled with anger. "This is irrelevant. The fact remains that Miss Evans spent several nights alone with a single man without proper chaperonage. In Boston, that would be enough to ruin a lady's reputation permanently." "This isn't Boston," Mrs. Jenkins retorted sharply. "This is Wyoming territory, where survival often depends on neighbors helping neighbors without worrying about what some busybody might think. Besides," Tommy added from his position near Boone, "she wasn't alone with Mr. Blackwell. Miguel and I were there the whole time. And Martha came back the second day. We can all testify to Miss Evans's perfect propriety during her stay." The tide of opinion was clearly turning against Walsh, and he knew it. His face contorted with barely suppressed rage as he played his final card. Perhaps the board would be interested to know that since her return to town, Miss Evans has continued to meet privately with Mr. Blackwell. I myself witnessed them in close conversation just yesterday. One must question the nature of their relationship. Before Grace could respond to this new accusation, Boone stepped forward, his expression dangerously calm. "If you're suggesting there's something improper about my friendship with Miss Evans, Walsh, then say it plainly. Because where I come from, making insinuations about a lady's character is the act of a coward." The challenge hung in the air, the tension in the room palpable. For a moment, Grace feared Walsh would accept it literally, that the confrontation would escalate to violence. Then Chairman Peterson banged his gavel forcefully. "That's enough. This meeting will maintain order." He turned to address the board. "I believe we've heard sufficient testimony on this matter. Mr. Walsh has raised his concerns and Miss Evans has addressed them adequately. Unless any other board member wishes to pursue this issue further, I suggest we consider it closed and move on to more productive business." He looked around the table. No one spoke, not even Walsh, though his expression promised that the matter was far from settled in his mind. "Very well. The board sees no cause for concern regarding Miss Evans's conduct, and her position as teacher is not in question. This meeting is adjourned." As the room began to clear, Grace found herself surrounded by well-wishers' parents, students, and neighbors expressing their support and indignation on her behalf. Mrs. Jenkins gave her a motherly hug, whispering, "You handled that beautifully, my dear." Through the crowd, Grace caught glimpses of Boone, similarly surrounded by people clapping him on the back and shaking his hand. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and his slight smile conveyed volumes pride, relief, and something warmer that made her heart race. It was nearly an hour before the crowd thinned enough for them to approach each other. By then, only a few stragglers remained in the hall, engaged in their own conversations. "That was quite an entrance," Grace remarked, her voice light despite the emotion behind it. "I didn't expect reinforcements. Word travels fast in a small community," Boone replied with a shrug. "When Tommy heard about Walsh's plans, he rode out to the neighboring ranches. Turns out a lot of people have no love for Silas Walsh and plenty of respect for you." Grace felt a rush of gratitude for these people who had come to her defense, despite knowing her for only a short time. "I'm beginning to understand why you chose to settle here, despite Walsh's hostility. There's a real community in Medicine Bow." "There is," Boone agreed. "Though I'll admit, I appreciated it more tonight than I ever have before." He hesitated, then added quietly, "I was worried about you facing that alone." "I wasn't alone," Grace corrected, her gaze holding his. "Not really. Even before you arrived, I knew I had friends here." She paused, then added softly, "Including you." Boone's expression softened. "Always, though I'd like to think we're more than just friends, Grace." The simple statement sent a tremor through her. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she knew had known, perhaps, since the moment he had pulled her from the flood waters. Instead of answering directly, Boone glanced around the nearly empty hall. "Walk with me. It's a beautiful evening, and I think we both could use some fresh air after that ordeal." Grace nodded, her heart racing as they stepped outside into the cool evening air. The main street was quiet, most businesses closed for the night, only the saloon at the far end showing signs of activity. They walked in silence for a few minutes, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalk. "Walsh won't give up easily," Boone said eventually, his tone serious. "He's a man used to getting his way, and he doesn't take defeat well." "I know," Grace acknowledged, "but I'm not afraid of him anymore, not after tonight." She looked up at Boone, her expression determined. "I won't let him chase me away from the life I'm building here." Boone stopped walking, turning to face her fully. In the soft glow of the street lamp, his features were cast in shadows, but his eyes were bright and intent. "I'm glad to hear that. Because I've been thinking a lot since the flood, Grace, about life and what's important and what I want for my future." Grace's breath caught in her throat. "And what have you concluded?" "That life is too short and too uncertain to waste time being afraid of what might happen." He took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I nearly died in that war and again in that flood. Both times, I was given another chance. I don't intend to waste it." His hand reached for hers, warm and calloused as his fingers intertwined with hers. "I know we haven't known each other long, Grace Evans, but I think I've known since I pulled you from that canyon that you were someone special. Someone I want in my life, not just as a friend or a neighbor, but as more. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must hear it. "Boone, are you saying, I'm saying I care for you," he interrupted gently. "Deeply. More than I thought possible in such a short time, and if you feel even a fraction of the same, I'd like the chance to court you properly. No rushed decisions, no pressure. Just the opportunity to see if what I feel, what I hope we both feel, might grow into something lasting." The earnestness in his voice, the vulnerability in his expression, touched Grace deeply. This was not the impetuosity of youth or the calculated maneuvering she had experienced with suitors in Boston. This was a man who had seen the worst of life, who had built himself a solitary existence, now offering to make space in that life for her. "I'd like that," she whispered, her own voice unsteady with emotion. "Very much." The smile that broke across Boone's face transformed him, erasing the lines of worry and revealing a youthful joy that took her breath away. Slowly, giving her every chance to step away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it was barely more than a whisper of contact. Yet that simple touch conveyed more genuine affection than all the practiced embraces of her previous suitors combined. When he pulled back, his eyes searching hers for confirmation that he hadn't overstepped, Grace found herself leaning forward to recapture his lips, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. This second kiss was deeper, a promise and a beginning rolled into one perfect moment. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Boone rested his forehead against hers, his smile mirroring her own. "I should walk you home," he murmured, though he made no move to step away. "Before Mrs. Hollister sends out a search party." Grace laughed softly, reluctantly pulling back but keeping her hand in his. "Yes, I suppose we should be mindful of appearances, especially after tonight's drama." They walked the short distance to Mrs. Hollister's house in companionable silence, their clasped hands swinging gently between them. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast Wyoming sky, and Grace felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before her father's death, perhaps not even then. At her door, Boone kissed her once more, a brief, sweet contact that left her wanting more, yet content with the promise of future moments together. "May I call on you tomorrow?" he asked, his voice low. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," Grace replied honestly, her smile radiant in the moonlight. As she watched him walk away, Grace felt as though her life in Medicine Bow was truly beginning, not as an escape from her past, but as a journey toward a future filled with possibilities she had never dared imagine. The following weeks saw a flowering of their courtship, conducted with a blend of frontier practicality and traditional romance that suited them both. Boone would ride into town several times a week, sometimes to take Grace on proper outings, dinners at the hotel restaurant, Sunday picnics by the river, attendance at community gatherings, and sometimes simply to help her with tasks around the schoolhouse or to bring fresh produce from his garden. For her part, Grace found herself visiting the Diamond B Ranch on weekends, usually accompanied by Mrs. Hollister or one of her older students as a nod to propriety. She came to know the rhythm of ranch life, the seasonal cycles of calving and branding and moving cattle to summer pastures. She befriended Martha, Boone's housekeeper, a no-nonsense woman with a soft spot for her employer and a surprisingly ribald sense of humor. Their relationship deepened with each encounter, built on mutual respect and growing affection. Grace discovered that beneath Boone's reserved exterior lay a man of surprising depth, thoughtful, well-read despite limited formal education, and possessed of a quiet wit that emerged more frequently as they grew comfortable with each other. Boone, in turn, found in Grace not just the refined education he had admired from the start, but also an unexpected resilience and adaptability that allowed her to thrive in the demanding frontier environment. The town watched their courtship with generally benevolent interest. There were a few raised eyebrows and whispered comments, particularly from those still influenced by Silas Walsh. But for the most part, the people of Medicine Bow seemed pleased to see two respected members of their community finding happiness together. Walsh himself remained a shadow on their contentment, his hostility undiminished by his defeat at the school board meeting. Though he made no further public accusations against Grace, his influence could be felt in subtle ways. Business owners suddenly reluctant to extend credit to Boone. Potential students whose parents found excuses not to enroll them in Grace's classes. Small incidents of vandalism at both the schoolhouse and the Diamond Bee that could never be definitively traced back to Walsh, but bore his signature nonetheless. Summer gave way to fall. The Wyoming landscape transformed by vibrant hues of red and gold before the first snows blanketed the rolling hills. As winter approached, bringing with it the promise of long, cold nights and the isolation that heavy snowfall could create, Boone and Grace found themselves at a crossroads in their relationship. It was a crisp November evening when Boone invited Grace to dinner at the Diamond Bee, sending Tommy with the wagon to collect her from town. When she arrived, she was surprised to find the ranch house transformed, lanterns glowing in every window, the table set with the good china that Martha kept for special occasions, and Boone himself dressed in his Sunday best, his usually unruly hair neatly combed. "What's the occasion?" Grace asked as he helped her from the wagon, noting the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from him. Can't a man prepare a special evening for the woman he loves without raising suspicions? Boone replied with attempted casualness, though the tips of his ears had reddened in a way Grace had come to find endearing. The word "loves" hung between them. Not for the first time they had acknowledged their feelings months ago, but somehow weighted with additional significance tonight. Grace felt a flutter of anticipation as she allowed him to escort her into the warmth of the house. Dinner was a quiet affair, just the two of them, Martha having prepared the meal before discreetly absenting herself to the foreman's house for the evening. They talked of ordinary things: Grace's students, Boone's plans for spring planting, the latest letter from Grace's mother in Boston, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense of something important hovering just beyond the conversation. Finally, as they finished the apple pie Martha had baked for dessert, Boone set down his fork and reached across the table to take Grace's hand. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain, "about the winter coming and how the heavy snows can make travel between town and the ranch difficult, sometimes impossible." Grace nodded, remembering the stories she had heard of blizzards that had isolated homesteads for weeks at a time. "It will be hard not seeing you as often," she acknowledged, squeezing his hand. "That's just it," Boone replied, his blue eyes intent on hers. "I don't want to go weeks without seeing you, Grace, not this winter or any winter to come." He took a deep breath, then continued in a rush. "I want to wake up every morning with you beside me. I want to build a life with you, raise a family with you, grow old with you." Grace's heart began to race as Boone pushed back his chair and, still holding her hand, knelt beside her. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a delicate ring with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Grace Evans, these past months have been the happiest of my life. You've brought light and laughter back into a world I thought would always be shadowed by the past." I love you more than I ever thought possible, and if you'll have me, I promise to spend the rest of my days trying to make you as happy as you've made me." His voice, steady through battles and business dealings, trembled slightly as he asked, "Will you marry me?" Tears blurred Grace's vision as she looked down at this strong, good man kneeling before her, offering her not just a ring but a future filled with love and partnership. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Boone Blackwell, I will marry you." Joy transformed his face as he slid the ring onto her finger, then rose to pull her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words could not express. When they finally parted, both breathless and laughing through tears, Boone rested his forehead against hers. "I had a whole speech prepared," he admitted ruefully, "about how I know I can't offer you the luxuries you had in Boston, but I promise to work every day to give you the best life I can." "I don't need luxuries," Grace assured him, her hands framing his beloved face. "I need you. I need this life we've started building together. Everything else is just details." They spent the evening planning their future, dreams and practical considerations interwoven as they discussed everything from the timing of the wedding. Before Christmas, they decided, to avoid the worst of the winter weather, to where they would live. The ranch house would need expansion, Boone acknowledged, to accommodate a family. To whether Grace would continue teaching, yes, at least until children came along, and perhaps even after. It was late when Tommy returned with the wagon to take Grace back to town, both of them reluctant to part, but aware of the need to maintain propriety until their marriage. The ride back to Medicine Bow was spent in a happy daze, Grace's hand repeatedly straying to the ring on her finger, tangible proof that the happiness she felt wasn't just a dream. News of their engagement spread quickly through the small community. Mrs. Hollister was the first to know, her delight evident as she immediately began planning what contributions she could make to the wedding festivities. By noon the next day, a steady stream of well-wishers had visited the schoolhouse, from students bearing wildflower bouquets to parents offering congratulations, and, in some cases, thinly veiled relief that the town's bachelor rancher and unmarried schoolteacher had finally made their relationship official. Not everyone shared in the general approval, of course. Silas Walsh, upon hearing the news, reportedly broke a glass in the saloon and stormed out without paying his tab. And there were a few older residents who muttered about the hasty nature of the engagement, though 6 months of courtship was hardly scandalous by frontier standards. But for the most part, Medicine Bow embraced the upcoming nuptials with enthusiasm. The women of the town, led by Mrs. Jenkins and Mrs. Hollister, formed a committee to prepare the church and arrange the wedding feast. The men, not to be outdone, organized a barn raising of sorts at the Diamond B, expanding the ranch house with a new wing that would serve as a proper bedroom for the married couple, with space for future additions to the family. The wedding was set for December 15th, a date chosen to avoid the Christmas rush but hopefully before the worst of the winter storms. As the day approached, preparations intensified. Grace found herself caught up in a whirlwind of dress fittings. Mrs. Peterson, a skilled seamstress, had offered to remake her own wedding gown for Grace. Menu planning and finishing the school term before the holiday break, Boone, meanwhile, threw himself into preparing the ranch for his bride. In addition to overseeing the house expansion, he purchased new furnishings, ordered books he thought Grace might enjoy for the long winter evenings, and even splurged on a proper piano, remembering her mention of playing in her Boston home. When it arrived, transported with great difficulty from Laramie, the entire ranch turned out to hear Grace play, her talented fingers bringing music to the Diamond B for the first time in its existence. 2 days before the wedding, as Grace was making final preparations to move her belongings to the ranch, a visitor arrived at her door, her mother, Elizabeth Evans, looking travel-worn but determined, having made the long journey from Boston upon receiving Grace's letter announcing her engagement. "Mother," Grace exclaimed, embracing the older woman with a mixture of joy and apprehension. They had maintained a cordial correspondence since Grace's move west, but there had been an underlying tension. Elizabeth had never fully approved of her daughter's decision to leave Boston, viewing it as an impulsive reaction to grief rather than a considered choice. "Grace, my dear," Elizabeth replied, returning the embrace before stepping back to study her daughter critically. "You look different, stronger somehow. The frontier agrees with you, it seems." "It does," Grace confirmed, ushering her mother into the small sitting room of Mrs. Hollister's house. "I've found purpose here, Mother, and happiness." Elizabeth's expression softened. "So I see. And this rancher of yours, is he the source of that happiness? Or merely a convenient attachment in a place with limited options?" The question was blunt, but not unkind. Elizabeth Evans had never been one to mince words, a trait Grace had inherited and come to value more in her time on the frontier, where directness was prized over social niceties. "Boone is." Grace paused, searching for words that could convey the depth of her feelings. "He's the most honorable man I've ever known, Mother. Strong, not just physically but in character. Kind, though he hides it behind a reserved manner. And he loves me not as an ornament or an accessory to his life, but as a partner, an equal." Elizabeth studied her daughter's face, noting the glow of genuine happiness that animated her features when speaking of her betrothed. "Well," she said finally, "I look forward to meeting this paragon who has captured my practical daughter's heart so thoroughly." The meeting between Boone and Elizabeth took place that evening at the hotel restaurant, a neutral ground that offered more privacy than Mrs. Hollister's parlor. Grace watched with nervous anticipation as her fiancé and her mother sized each other up across the table. Elizabeth, with the shrewd assessment of a Boston society matron accustomed to evaluating potential sons-in-law. Boone, with the quiet dignity of a man who knew his worth, was not measured by Eastern standards of wealth or lineage. To Grace's relief, the dinner progressed smoothly. Elizabeth asked direct questions about Boone's background, his ranch, his plans for the future, and he answered with equal directness, neither apologizing for his modest circumstances nor attempting to impress with false promises. By the time dessert was served, they had reached a state of mutual respect, if not yet warmth. "And what do you think of my daughter's teaching?" Elizabeth inquired as they finished their coffee. "Will you expect her to give it up after the wedding?" "That's Grace's decision to make, not mine," Boone replied without hesitation. "She's an excellent teacher from all accounts. The children of Medicine Bow would be poorer for losing her. But the ranch is a fair distance from town, especially in winter, and there may come a time when the journey becomes impractical." He glanced at Grace, his expression softening. "We've discussed the possibility of starting a small school at the ranch eventually, for our own children and those of neighboring ranches." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose at this evidence of long-term planning. "I see you've given this considerable thought." "We both have," Grace interjected, reaching across the table to take Boone's hand. "This isn't a hasty decision, Mother. We know what we want, and we're building a future together, step by step." Something in Elizabeth's expression shifted, a softening around the eyes that suggested acceptance, if not yet full approval. "Well, Mr. Blackwell, it seems my daughter has found in you what she always claimed to want: a man who values her mind as well as her heart." "I can hardly object to that, can I?" As they parted for the evening, Elizabeth drew Grace aside for a private word. "He's not what I imagined for you," she admitted quietly, "but I can see he makes you happy. And perhaps that's what matters most." "It is," Grace assured her, grateful for even this qualified blessing. "Will you stay for the wedding? It would mean so much to have you there." Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course. I didn't travel all this way to miss seeing my only daughter married, even if it is to a Wyoming rancher rather than a Boston banker." The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the December sun casting a golden glow over the snow-covered landscape. In Mrs. Hollister's best guest room, Grace prepared for her wedding with the help of her mother, Mrs. Jenkins, and several other women from town who had become dear friends over the past months. Her dress, remade from Mrs. Peterson's wedding gown, was a simple but elegant affair of ivory satin with lace trim, modified to suit Grace's more slender frame and the practical necessities of a winter wedding in Wyoming territory. Her hair was arranged in a loose chignon adorned with small white flowers, and around her neck hung a single strand of pearls, a gift from her mother, who had worn them at her own wedding 30 years earlier. "You look beautiful, my dear," Elizabeth said softly, adjusting the pearls with gentle fingers. "Your father would be so proud." The mention of her father brought tears to Grace's eyes. "I wish he could be here," she whispered. Elizabeth squeezed her hand. "He is in his way. In the strength he gave you, the independence he encouraged, the love of learning he instilled. Those gifts led you here to this day, to the man you've chosen." Before Grace could respond, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hollister peeked in, her face alight with excitement. "It's time, dear. The church is full to bursting, and your young man is waiting at the altar looking like he might explode from happiness at any moment." The small church of Medicine Bow was indeed packed with well-wishers, not just the townspeople Grace had come to know, but ranchers and their families from miles around, many of whom had braved the winter roads to celebrate the union of the respected schoolteacher and the rancher who had saved her from the flood. Flowers adorned every available surface, and evergreen boughs filled the air with their fresh scent. At the altar stood Boone, looking both nervous and elated in a new suit ordered specially from Denver. Tommy stood beside him as best man, beaming with pride at his boss's happiness. As the first notes of the wedding march sounded from the old pump organ, Boone turned, his eyes finding Grace at the entrance to the church. The love that blazed in his expression as she walked toward him, escorted by Mr. Jenkins in place of her father, brought fresh tears to Grace's eyes. This was right, she knew with absolute certainty. This man, this place, this life they would build together, it was exactly where she was meant to be. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, the traditional vows spoken with genuine conviction by both bride and groom. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Boone's kiss was tender yet passionate, promising a lifetime of love and partnership. The celebration that followed at the town hall was a joyous affair, with music provided by local musicians, food contributed by nearly every household in Medicine Bow, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Grace found herself passed from partner to partner in traditional dances, though she always returned to Boone's arms, each reunion sweeter than the last. As the festivities wound down, Boone drew her aside, his expression serious despite the joy of the day. "There's something I need to tell you," he said quietly. "I received word yesterday that Silas Walsh has sold his ranch. He's moving to Colorado territory." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "After all his threats and posturing, he's just leaving?" Boone nodded, a hint of satisfaction in his smile. "Apparently, his position here became untenable after the school board meeting. The community chose sides, and it wasn't his. Without the influence he craved, there was little reason for him to stay. "So our future here will be free of his shadow," Grace marveled, feeling as if a weight she'd grown accustomed to carrying had suddenly lifted. "Our future is bright in every way," Boone agreed, pulling her close for another kiss. Later that night, as they rode to the Diamond B Ranch in the covered sleigh Boone had prepared for the occasion, Grace nestled against her husband's side, wrapped in warm furs against the winter chill. The stars overhead seemed exceptionally brilliant, their light reflected in the pristine snow that blanketed the landscape. "Happy, Mrs. Blackwell?" Boone asked, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Perfectly," Grace replied, still savoring the sound of her new name. "Though I'm having trouble believing this is real. Just a few months ago I was trapped in that canyon, certain I was going to die, and now—" "And now you're stuck with me for life," Boone finished for her, his voice teasing but his eyes serious as they met hers. "I thank God every day that I was there to find you, Grace. Not just because I was able to save you, but because in doing so, I found something I never knew I was missing: a partner, a friend, a love I never thought possible." "It seems we saved each other," Grace observed softly, remembering the reserved, solitary man she had first met and marveling at the transformation love had wrought in both of them. As they approached the ranch, Grace could see lights blazing in every window of their home, Martha's welcome gift, ensuring the newlyweds would return to a warm, inviting house. The sight filled her with a profound sense of rightness, of coming home in the deepest sense of the word. Boone drew the sleigh to a halt before the front porch, then turned to face her fully. "I love you, Grace Blackwell," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of a vow. "Today, tomorrow, always." "And I love you, Boone Blackwell," she replied, sealing the promise with a kiss as the first soft snowflakes of a gentle winter storm began to fall around them, blessing the beginning of their life together. In the years that followed, the story of how Boone Blackwell had ridden into a raging flood to save Grace Evans became something of a legend in Medicine Bow and the surrounding territory. It was told and retold, embellished with each telling until it took on the quality of a frontier fairy tale: the brave rancher, the beautiful schoolteacher trapped in the canyon, the dramatic rescue that led to love and marriage. The reality, as Grace and Boone knew, was both simpler and more profound. Their life together was not the stuff of fairy tales but of everyday courage and commitment: the courage to build a life in a harsh but beautiful land, the commitment to face whatever challenges came their way together. The Diamond B Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Grace's education and organizational skills complemented Boone's practical experience and instinctive understanding of the land. Together, they expanded the operation, adding sheep to the cattle, experimenting with new crops in the fertile valley land, even establishing a small dairy that supplied butter and cheese to Medicine Bow and neighboring communities. True to their discussion, Grace continued teaching for several years, riding into town when weather permitted. But after the birth of their first child, a son they named Benjamin after Boone's father, the journey became impractical. Instead, Grace began teaching the children of neighboring ranches in a small schoolhouse Boone built on their property, creating an educational outpost that served families who had previously been too isolated to access formal schooling. Their family grew with the birth of a daughter, Eleanor, named for Grace's maternal grandmother, and later another son, Thomas, in honor of the loyal ranch hand who had become like family to them both. The Diamond B became known not just as a successful ranch, but as a warm and welcoming home where neighbors gathered for harvest festivals, holiday celebrations, and the famous summer picnics that Grace organized each year on the anniversary of her rescue. The flood that had nearly claimed Grace's life eventually became a distant memory, though neither she nor Boone ever forgot the lesson it had taught them about the preciousness of life and the unexpected ways love could enter one's world. Each spring, when the snowmelt filled the streams and occasionally threatened to overflow their banks, they would hold each other a little closer, remembering the day that had brought them together and thankful for every moment since. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Boone surprised Grace with a journey back to Boston to visit her mother, who had become too frail to travel west again, but who had developed a warm relationship with her son-in-law and grandchildren through years of correspondence. The visit was a joyous reunion, but also a confirmation for Grace that her heart truly belonged in Wyoming, in the life she and Boone had built together. As they stood on the deck of the train carrying them back west, watching the eastern landscape give way to the open plains, Grace leaned against her husband's solid strength, his arm around her waist as familiar and necessary as her own heartbeat. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, a question he still posed occasionally, as if even after a decade together he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Grace turned in his arms, studying the face she loved older now, lined with the evidence of years spent working under the western sun, but still handsome, still lit from within by the goodness that had first drawn her to him. "Not one," she assured him, the words as true as they had been on their wedding day. "My life began the day you pulled me from that canyon, Boone Blackwell. Everything before was just preparation for loving you." His kiss, still capable of quickening her pulse after all these years, was his answer, a reaffirmation of the bond that had begun in danger and desperation, but had grown into something enduring and beautiful. A love story that had become, like the land they called home, both a challenge and a blessing, demanding everything they had to give but returning that investment 100-fold in joy and fulfillment. And as the train carried them west, toward home and family and the future they continued to build together, both Grace and Boone knew with absolute certainty that the greatest adventure of their lives had not been the dramatic rescue in Devil's Canyon, but rather the quiet, daily miracle of the life they had created together in its aftermath. A life of purpose, passion, and abiding love that would sustain them through all the seasons yet to come.